The summons arrived without fanfare. A thick, cream-colored envelope slipped beneath Marcus's heavy oak door. His reclusive existence, meticulously constructed over 2 decades, rarely tolerated such intrusions. He was a creature of parchment and forgotten timelines, a historian whose only companions were the spectral voices echoing from ancient texts. His small, cluttered study, perpetually scented with old paper and brewing tea, was his sanctuary, a fortress against the clamor of the contemporary world. The envelope contained a formal directive from a solicitor's office, an address Marcus vaguely recognized as being several counties away. It spoke of an inheritance, an unexpected legacy from a distant relative he barely remembered. A great-aunt whose existence had been a whispered rumor rather than a confirmed fact. Blackwood Manor. The name, even on the crisp page, seemed to possess a faint, resonant chill. Marcus reread the document, his brow furrowed. His initial reaction was one of detached annoyance. Property was a burden, a tangible anchor to a world he preferred to observe from a distance. Yet the manor's age, hinted at by the solicitor's terse description, a property of considerable historical interest, piqued a flicker of academic curiosity. He knew the name, Blackwood Manor, not from family lore, but from obscure regional histories. He dismissed these as the predictable embellishments of rural superstition, the inevitable folklore clinging to any structure that had stood for centuries. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself navigating a rental car down a winding, increasingly narrow road, the landscape growing starker with every mile. The familiar urban sprawl had long since receded, replaced by skeletal trees and fields of dormant stubble. The sky hung like a bruised canvas, pressing down on the flat, desolate expanse. He passed a frozen lake, its surface an unbroken sheet of gray ice, reflecting the bleak light with a dull, metallic sheen. The isolation was absolute, a quality Marcus typically found comforting. Here, however, it felt less like peace and more like a deliberate excision from the world. Blackwood Manor emerged from a thicket of gnarled oaks, a monolithic silhouette against the bruised sky. It was larger than he had anticipated, a sprawling testament to an earlier, grander architectural ambition. No smoke curled from its chimneys, no light pierced the gloom of its interior. It was a structure utterly devoid of welcome, a place that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The solicitor, a thin man with a perpetually apologetic expression, met him at the imposing oak front door. "Mr. Thorne," the solicitor began, his voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something within the house itself. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. A unique property." Marcus offered a curt nod. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, giving the air a visible texture. "The utilities are minimal," the solicitor continued, his voice barely audible. "The previous owner preferred a certain simplicity. And the local legends, of course. Many believe the house to be unwell." He forced a strained smile that did not reach his eyes. Marcus merely grunted. "Superstition," he stated, his voice flat, echoing in the vast, silent space. He saw the solicitor flinch slightly. He was accustomed to such reactions. His pragmatic dismissal of the irrational often unsettled those who clung to it. He stepped further into the hall. Tapestries, faded and stiff with age, hung like shrouds from the walls, their scenes indistinguishable in the gloom. His historian's eye immediately began its work, cataloging the architectural details, estimating the age of the stone, the style of the cornices. He noted the subtle irregularities, the slight warp in a doorframe, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the floorboards beneath his feet. This was not merely a house. It was a relic, a repository of countless lives and forgotten eras. It represented an immense, untouched archive, a treasure trove for his research. Yet, beneath this professional appraisal, an unfamiliar current of unease began to stir. It was not fear, not precisely, but a prickle of caution. He rationalized it as the natural consequence of an unheeded ancient structure. He clutched the key, its cold metal a small, sharp anchor in a suddenly disorienting reality. The solicitor, a small, nervous man named Mr. Finch, closed the heavy oak door behind him with a resonant thud that seemed to echo Marcus's own skepticism. The air inside remained stubbornly heavy, still and impossibly cold, carrying the faint, cloying scent of damp earth and something else. A dry, mineral tang, like old rust mixed with dust. Marcus inhaled, a frown etching itself deeper between his brows. He attributed the chill to the building's age, the peculiar smell to stagnant air and decaying timbers. Old houses had quirks. This one simply had more. His initial task was clear: establish a base of operations. He had brought an extensive collection of primary sources, microfiche readers, and stacks of meticulously organized notes. He walked past several cavernous, unfurnished rooms, their windows overlooking overgrown gardens, before finding a chamber at the far end of the west wing. It was smaller, less imposing, with a large leaded pane window offering a view of a desolate, windswept expanse that ended in the distant, dull gleam of the frozen lake. This room, Marcus decided, would be his study. He began the laborious process of unpacking, his movements precise and methodical. Boxes filled with books on local history, architectural records, and genealogical charts were stacked against one wall. He arranged his research materials on the desk, creating neat piles of documents, his laptop a beacon of modernity amidst the antique gloom. As he worked, a subtle shift occurred. He paused, examining the grate. No discernible draft. Marcus straightened, listening intently. He attributed it to the creaks and groans of an old structure settling, a symphony of decay. His mind, trained in the dissection of historical fact, dismissed the fleeting sensations as products of an overactive imagination, perhaps amplified by the sheer isolation. Hours passed. The low, gray light of the afternoon waned, replaced by the deeper gloom of dusk. He was engrossed in a collection of estate records from the late 17th century, detailing repairs and alterations. He reached for a particular folio, only to find it not where he had placed it. It was on the floor, tucked beneath a stack of maps he was certain he had not touched. He must have knocked it over without realizing, or perhaps the stack had shifted. His meticulous nature rebelled against such sloppiness, yet he could not recall dropping it. He picked it up, returning it to its proper place with a firmer hand. Later, while cataloging a box of miscellaneous papers, he heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like distant voices speaking just beyond the range of comprehension. Nothing. Just the faint, earthy smell that seemed to permeate everything. He pulled away, shaking his head. Pipes. Old, faulty plumbing, perhaps. The house was a relic after all, and its internal mechanisms would be equally decrepit. He pushed aside a pile of architectural blueprints to make room for a new stack of documents. Beneath them, tucked into a hidden compartment of the desk he hadn't noticed before, was a small, leather-bound book. It was not part of his collection. Its cover was worn smooth, the leather cracked and dry. Marcus picked it up, a strange sense of anticipation, an academic's thrill of unexpected discovery, overriding his earlier unease. The pages were brittle, filled with elegant looping script. It was a journal. The first few entries were mundane, detailing weather and household affairs. But as he turned the fragile pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more frantic, the ink smudged in places. The stillness here is not peace, but a weight. It presses upon the mind, stripping away the familiar, leaving only echoes. Another entry weeks later. Marcus watched the frozen lake from my window. The house, it watches, too. It listens. Marcus feel its gaze upon me, even in my sleep. Marcus read on, his determination to rationalize now struggling against the stark, raw fear emanating from the pages. My past blurs, like smoke in a draft. The house consumes it. It wants everything. His analytical mind grappled with the implications. Delusions. Isolation could certainly induce such paranoia. He was alone, yet the room felt suddenly, impossibly crowded. The analytical mind of Marcus grappled with the implications. Delusions. Isolation could certainly induce such paranoia. The woman was clearly unwell, perhaps suffering from a mental decline exacerbated by the manor's oppressive atmosphere. Yet, the sheer specificity of her terror, the way she described the house, it lingered. He attempted to categorize the experience, filing it away as an unfortunate encounter with a disturbed individual, a byproduct of the manor's remote location. He preferred the concrete facts of history to the nebulous realm of psychological distress. Marcus attributed the initial sounds to the building's age, the groan of ancient timbers, the sigh of wind through ill-fitting windows, the creak of settling foundations. He heard them mostly at night, when the vast house amplified every trivial noise. But then, a new quality emerged. A low murmur, like distant conversations, would occasionally reach his ears from empty corridors. He would pause, straining to discern words, but the sounds would dissolve into the general crepitation of the old structure, leaving only a faint echo in his perception. He dismissed them as auditory pareidolia, the brain attempting to find patterns in random noise. A trick of the light, he reasoned, or perhaps a dust mote catching a stray beam. He would turn his head sharply, but the space would be empty, the heavy air undisturbed. The occurrences were infrequent, too ephemeral to constitute a threat. Yet they etched themselves into his awareness, a minor irritant to his otherwise meticulous focus. He found himself blinking more, his gaze sweeping the periphery of his sightline, an unconscious vigilance he resented. Sleep offered no respite. His nights became a fragmented tapestry of vivid, unsettling nightmares. He attributed the disturbed sleep to the change in environment, the physical and mental strain of unpacking and organizing, the general solitude. He sought refuge in his work, meticulously sifting through the manor's archives. The previous owner, a retired scholar, had left behind an exhaustive collection of documents, property deeds, family letters, local newspaper clippings, and even personal journals spanning centuries. Marcus began to trace the lineage of the manor's inhabitants, searching for a pattern, a rational explanation for the local superstitions. The first owner, a merchant, had reportedly descended into a profound melancholy after a few years of residency, eventually disappearing, his body never found, though a note was discovered near the frozen lake suggesting a deliberate act. The subsequent owners, a family of landed gentry, saw their eldest son confined to a private wing, prone to violent outbursts and speaking to empty rooms before he too vanished. Isolation, madness, disappearance, or suicide. The pattern was undeniable, recurring across generations, across different personalities and eras. Each instance was explicitly linked to prolonged residency within the manor's walls. There were no external factors mentioned, no financial ruin or family feuds that could account for such a consistent, tragic outcome. It was always internal, always a decline into a profound, inexplicable despair or delusion. His clinical detachment began to fray. He reread the accounts, his brow furrowed. The sheer volume of evidence, the specificity of the decline, it challenged his skepticism. He glanced towards the window, beyond which the skeletal trees stood stark against the gray sky. The previous owner's note, the merchant's final words, had been discovered near its icy edge. The thought gave him a peculiar shiver, one that had nothing to do with the manor's inadequate heating. The house, he realized with a creeping unease, had a history not just of events, but of influence. Marcus sat amidst his scattered research, the compiled timeline a stark, chilling document. He had arranged the names, dates, and sparse notes across the antique desk, a grim tapestry of repeated tragedy. Each instance, a life consumed within these very walls. His historian's mind, trained to dissect and explain, found itself grappling with a pattern that defied logical explanation. Isolation, madness, disappearance, or suicide. There were no external factors mentioned, no plagues, no wars, no economic collapse to explain such consistent internal devastation. He pushed a hand through his hair, the faint scent of dust and old paper clinging to his fingers. The silence of the manor was not empty. It felt weighted, expectant. A low groan resonated from somewhere deep within the foundations, a sound he had attributed to old wood settling, to the wind. He rose, pacing the worn rug. He paused by the towering bookshelf, his fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume. He swore he heard a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 like a distant, struggling heart. He held his breath, straining his ears. Nothing. He dismissed it as an auditory hallucination, a product of fatigue and overactive imagination. But the feeling persisted. A prickling sensation on his neck, the undeniable impression of being observed, not by a person, but by something vast and ancient, something that permeated the very air he breathed. The house. His mind recoiled from the thought. It was a building, a collection of stone and timber, not an entity. Yet, the thought had taken root. He returned to his chair, attempting to refocus, but the words on the page blurred. The air in the study thickened, growing heavy, almost viscous. The light from the single lamp seemed to dim, though the bulb remained bright. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them. The study was no longer his. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by faded, threadbare velvet. The desk was different, a delicate writing table, and upon it, a half-finished letter, the ink a faded sepia. A woman stood by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid with despair. He saw the intricate stitching on her sleeve, the glint of a silver locket at her neck. She turned her head slightly, and he saw the curve of her cheek, the drawn, pale skin, the glint of a tear on her lash. He felt a profound, suffocating sorrow emanate from her, a despair so potent it stole his own breath. Her lips moved, though no sound reached him, a silent scream of agony. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the image flickered, wavered, and receded. The scent of decay lingered, a phantom echo. He gasped, his hand pressed against his chest. He had witnessed it. A waking dream? A hallucination brought on by stress? His rational mind scrambled for an explanation, any explanation, to contain the unsettling intrusion. He walked to the grand staircase, his hand gripping the polished banister. He blinked, and they were gone. The feeling of being watched intensified, a pressure on his skull, a prickling sensation across his scalp. He retreated to the kitchen, seeking the mundane comfort of a cup of tea. As the kettle whistled, he leaned against the counter, trying to ground himself in the present. The warmth of the mug was a small anchor. But then, the whistling seemed to warp, stretching into a high-pitched, desperate keen. The kitchen dissolved. He was standing on a shore, the air biting, sharp with the scent of ice and pine. Before him, a vast expanse of white, stretching to the distant skeletal trees. The frozen lake. The surface was a pristine, unbroken sheet of glass, reflecting the gray, bruised sky. A figure stood near the center, small against the immense white. A child. A young boy dressed in heavy winter clothing, his back to Marcus. The boy seemed to be staring at something beneath the ice. The boy raised a small, gloved hand, pointing. He took a step forward, compelled, desperate to see what held the child's attention. The ice cracked. A spiderweb of fractures shot out from beneath the child's feet. Marcus saw his eyes, wide and blue, reflecting the fractured ice. The water, black and frigid, swallowed him whole. The sound of the cracking ice, The child's silent scream echoed in Marcus's head, a cacophony of despair. He tried to move, to run, to shout, but his limbs were leaden, his voice trapped. He watched the hole in the ice, the ripples slowly fading, leaving only the pristine, unbroken white once more. He was back in the kitchen, the kettle still whistling, steam pluming from its spout. The mug of tea lay shattered on the floor, its contents seeping into the worn linoleum. His hands trembled violently. His breath hitched in his throat, a ragged, desperate sound. His skepticism, his carefully constructed wall of rational thought, had not merely fractured. It had shattered into 1,000 shards. This was not a trick of the mind. This was a memory, replayed, felt, experienced. The house had shown him. The house was not merely old, it was a witness, a keeper, and a devourer. Isolation deepens. Marcus sat amidst his scattered research, the compiled timeline a stark, chilling document. Each instance, a life consumed within these very walls. His historian's mind, trained to dissect and categorize, now grappled with an anomaly that defied all logic. The pattern was undeniable, yet its mechanism remained elusive, a predatory whisper in the house's ancient timbers. A shiver, not entirely from the manor's pervasive chill, traced his spine. He needed to step away, to clear his head, perhaps to share his findings with a colleague, however outlandish they might sound. He reached for his mobile phone, a modern anachronism on the polished mahogany. The screen glowed, then flickered, displaying no service. He tried again, moving closer to the tall, grimy window, then to the door. Nothing. A faint hum, like distant static, seemed to emanate from the very air around him, a barrier to the outside world. Frustration pricked at him, a sharp, unwelcome sensation. He pushed himself up from the desk, his muscles protesting the prolonged stillness. The soles of his feet connected with the cool, worn rug, a familiar texture now. As he moved toward the main hall, a subtle inertia seemed to drag at his limbs. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself were exerting a gentle, persistent pull, urging his back into its depths. The thought of the biting winter air outside, the glare of the low sun on the frozen landscape, felt suddenly unappealing. Here, within these walls, was his work, his purpose. The outside world seemed distant, irrelevant. It was an embrace, possessive and deep, that seeped into his bones. He was alone, yes, but not entirely. The house was a constant breathing presence. Days blurred. The precise passage of time became less critical than the next document to unearth, the next connection to draw. His clothes, once neatly pressed, now carried the faint, pervasive scent of aged paper and damp stone. Meals became an afterthought, often forgotten until a gnawing emptiness in his stomach reminded him to find a tin of soup or a stale biscuit. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, populated by fragmented images of the manor's past inhabitants, their faces indistinct, but their despair palpable. Yet he woke each morning with a renewed, almost feverish determination to continue his work, the house's history becoming his sole, consuming focus. One afternoon, a sliver of sunlight, weak and pale, pierced through a high window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the frigid air. It reminded him of the world beyond, a world of sharp, clean light. A fleeting impulse seized him. He would walk to the frozen lake. It was a familiar landmark, a place of stark, beautiful desolation. He pulled on a heavy coat, the fabric stiff with disuse, and stepped out. The air hit him with a physical force, a brutal shock after the house's constant, peculiar warmth. The wind howled, a mournful cry that tore at his exposed skin. His breath plumed in thick white clouds. The ground was hard, iron-bound with frost, crunching under his boots. Each step away from the manor felt like an effort against an invisible tide. a struggle against a profound internal resistance. The walk was longer than he remembered, the landscape bleaker. The trees, skeletal and black, clawed at the slate-gray sky. Finally, he reached the edge of the frozen lake. The vast expanse of ice, a milky, opaque sheet, stretched out to meet a distant, snow-dusted shoreline. It was utterly silent, save for the shriek of the wind and the faint, unsettling groan of the ice shifting beneath its own weight. A profound sense of emptiness washed over him. Not peaceful, but draining. He felt utterly exposed, vulnerable. The edges of his vision seemed to waver, the distant trees blurring, then sharpening again. He blinked, and the illusion vanished, leaving only the dull sheen of ice. The purpose, the need for fresh air had evaporated, leaving only a vague sense of unease. The journey back was quicker, almost a hurried retreat. The pervasive warmth, the familiar scent of old paper and dust, wrapped around him like a shroud. He peeled off his coat, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, feeling an odd exhaustion, a profound depletion. He was home. The thought, once absurd, now settled in his mind with a terrifying, undeniable comfort. The compiled timeline lay scattered, a grim mosaic across the polished mahogany. Marcus had spent the last 2 days staring at it, the pages refusing to coalesce into a coherent narrative. Each name, each date, a phantom limb of knowledge, severed just before understanding could take root. He could recall the exact dimensions of a medieval siege engine, but struggled to remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. A chill, not from the drafty hall, traced its way up his spine. He rose, intending to retrieve a forgotten volume from the library. The library, a sanctuary of ordered thought, was a place he could rely on. He walked down the familiar corridor, the worn oriental rug muffling his footsteps. He turned the corner, expecting the grand double doors of the library, but instead, a solid expanse of dark wood paneling met his gaze. No door, just an unbroken wall, adorned with a single ornate tapestry depicting a hunt scene. He blinked. He walked back, retraced his steps, counted the archways. This was the correct turn. He pressed, knocked, searched for a hidden latch. Nothing. His breath hitched. This was impossible. He had been in the library yesterday, only hours ago. A tremor started in his hands. A hidden passage? A secret door he hadn't noticed? But the paneling was seamless, the wood grain uninterrupted. He was certain this was the way. He knew it. Yet, the house presented a lie. He returned to the study, the timeline now seeming less like historical record and more like a fever dream. He picked up a quill from the desk, its feather brittle, its tip still stained with ancient ink. A faint metallic scent clung to it. Not his ink. He had been using a ballpoint pen. He ran his thumb over the shaft, a strange familiarity blossoming within him. The hand was thin, aristocratic, its knuckles prominent. They will never understand. A voice whispered in his mind, clear as if he had spoken it himself. But it was not his voice. It was deeper, more resonant, laced with a bitter edge. Marcus dropped the quill as if it had burned him. He stared at his own hands, calloused from years of handling old books, not the pale, slender fingers he had just envisioned. Who was they? And what was it that they would never understand? He closed his eyes, forcing his own name into his thoughts. Marcus. My name is Marcus. I am a historian. I live in... He opened his eyes and looked around the study. The room was the same, yet subtly different. A small, intricately carved wooden box sat on a side table. A box he had no recollection of seeing before. Curiosity, a deep, compelling urge drew him to it. He opened it. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a tarnished silver locket. He picked it up. As his fingers closed around it, another memory, sharp and vivid, erupted in his mind. He was standing on the edge of a vast, desolate expanse. The ground beneath his feet was treacherous, a thin layer of snow over slick ice. Before him, stretching into a hazy white horizon, was a frozen lake. The wind howled. A mournful lament, small and distant, stood on the ice, arms outstretched, beckoning. But the figure called again, its voice a siren song, promising release. Marcus gasped, dropping the locket. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against his constricted chest. He was in his study. The memory was not his. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that was not entirely his own. He saw a flicker, a subtle shift in the contours of his own jawline, a momentary sharpening of his features, a ghost of another man's visage superimposed upon his own. He rushed from the study, needing to reorient himself, to find something familiar, something undeniably his. He ran up the grand staircase. Its banister now felt strangely alien beneath his palm. He reached the landing, intending to go to his bedroom, but the corridor stretched further than he remembered, a dizzying tunnel of identical doors. The light was dim, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. He tried the first door. It was locked. The second, locked. The third, unlocked. He pushed it open. It was not his bedroom. It was a small, desolate nursery filled with antique toys. A rocking horse with one missing eye, a doll with a cracked porcelain face, a miniature wooden cradle, empty. A profound sorrow washed over him, a sense of loss so acute it brought tears to his eyes. But he had no children. He had never married. This grief was not his. He backed out slowly, the door creaking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the silent house. He looked down the long corridor, the doors blurring into an endless, repeating pattern. The house was no longer merely a structure. It was a labyrinth, its passages shifting, its rooms reconfiguring, each change a deliberate, malicious act. He was lost, not just in the house, but within himself. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to press in, eroding the boundaries of his mind, dissolving the man named Marcus into the very fabric of this ancient, hungry place. He was no longer just an occupant. He was becoming part of its grim tapestry, a thread woven into its endless, tragic story. He would grasp a fact, turn it over, and then watch it dissolve, leaving only the ghost of its presence. The air in the study had grown heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and something else. Something metallic and faint, like rain on rusted iron. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves, a pervasive dampness that chilled him despite the roaring fire. Names of distant relatives, once clear in the genealogical charts, now blurred into indistinct shadows. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. He needed to focus. The manor demanded it. Or rather, something within the manor demanded it. He felt its presence now, not as a haunting, but as a vast, quiet hunger. It was a subtle pressure, a constant, almost imperceptible drain. He picked up a brittle, leather-bound journal, one he'd dismissed earlier as mere melancholic ramblings. It belonged to an ancestor, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the late 17th century. Her script, once elegant, grew increasingly erratic towards the final entries. The house watches, he had written, the ink faded to sepia. It takes, not coin, not chattel, but the very essence of thought. My memories, like threads, are plucked from the loom. The faces of my children, they fade. Their laughter, a distant echo. What does it want? He had attributed Eleanor's decline to the harshness of the era, to isolation. He flipped through other documents, the official records of disappearances and inexplicable deaths connected to Blackwood Manor. A young architect, commissioned to remodel a wing, found wandering naked in the woods, babbling incoherently about empty spaces before dying of exposure. A caretaker, discovered in the cellar, eyes wide and vacant, starved to death despite ample food stores. He looked down at his own notes, at the timeline he'd tried to construct. The gaps weren't just missing information, they were absences. Lives cut short, minds shattered, not by spectral intervention, but by a methodical internal attrition. The house didn't haunt, it devoured. His gaze fell upon an old map of the estate, tucked into one of the archival boxes. A prominent feature, starkly rendered, was the frozen lake at the edge of the property. Its surface a blank expanse of white. A small, penciled X marked a spot near its center, with an almost illegible notation. The fisherman, his mind quite gone. He was found by the ice. Marcus remembered reading about that incident in the local archives. A man who had inexplicably drilled a hole in the thick winter ice and then simply sat there, staring into the black water until he froze solid, his fishing rod still in his hand, his face described as utterly devoid of expression. Not fear, not pain, just nothing. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying precision. This wasn't a haunting. This was a sustained, deliberate act of consumption. It fed. It had fed on Eleanor, on Alistair Finch, on the architect, on the caretaker, on the fisherman by the frozen lake. It had fed on every soul that had dared to inhabit it, growing stronger, more ancient, more insidious with each new meal. He looked around the study, the heavy oak paneling, the towering bookshelves, the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece. They no longer felt like architectural details. They felt like sinews, like bones, like the very fabric of a monstrous organism. The manor was a vast, silent maw, and he, Marcus, the skeptical historian, was its current, preferred meal. It was a sensation, a gentle tug, like a spider testing a web. The specific shade of green on the leaves, the exact texture of the wood. They blurred, softened, becoming indistinct. He was being eaten, slowly, from the inside out. His past, his identity, his very self all becoming sustenance for this monstrous house. He wasn't just losing his mind, it was being taken. It was simply feeding. And it would not stop until there was nothing left. The official records, brittle and yellowed, crumbled slightly under Marcus's touch. Eleanor, the gardener, a succession of caretakers, each disappearing or succumbing to an unidentifiable malaise. The pattern, once dismissed as tragic coincidence, now pulsed with a malignant clarity. The house was not merely haunted, it was a predator, a living entity that fed on the minds and lives within its walls. A cold dread, far more profound than any he had known, coiled in his gut, seizing his breath. It wasn't just a house. It was a hungry, ancient thing, and he was its current meal. A flicker of resistance ignited within him, a desperate, incandescent spark against the encroaching psychological fog. He would not be another entry in its grim ledger. His mind, usually a fortress of logic, reeled, but a core of stubborn determination remained. He had to fight. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, tearing through the library. Books, once sources of comfort, now felt like silent, judgmental witnesses. He pulled volumes from shelves, scattering dust motes that danced in the dim light. His fingers, trembling, traced over spines, seeking anything that deviated, any text that hinted at the manor's true nature, beyond the sanitized histories and local superstitions. These were not atmospheric quirks. They were the house's manifestations, its slow, deliberate exhalations. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure. He ignored it, pushing deeper into the manor's forgotten corners. A single, small, iron-bound chest sat tucked behind a stack of rotting burlap sacks. dust coated its surface, thick and undisturbed. Inside, nestled among dried herbs and a few tarnished silver trinkets, was a slender, leather-bound journal. Its cover was blank, save for a symbol etched into the leather, a stylized interlocking knot, reminiscent of ancient Celtic designs, yet subtly alien, more like tendrils grasping. He opened it, the pages crackling softly. The script was an archaic hand, dense and spidery, filled with strange symbols interspersed with Latin and an older, unfamiliar language. It wasn't a diary, it was a record, a warning. The entries detailed not merely the house's malevolence, but its mechanism. It absorbed, it consumed, it twisted. And then, a section caught his eye, written in a different, firmer hand, almost a desperate plea. This was it. This was the glimmer. He deciphered fragments. The heart of the blight, sustained by the waters. A sacrifice not of blood, of memory, at the cusp of the longest night, where the land surrenders to the frigid embrace. The text spoke of a particular location, a place where the house's tendrils were weakest, where its influence thinned. It described a specific artifact, a shard of reflection, which, when imbued with a focused intent, could temporarily disrupt the house's connection to its anchor. His gaze fell upon a crude, hand-drawn map tucked into the back of the journal. It depicted the manor, its sprawling grounds, and then, starkly outlined beyond the tree line, a body of water. Scrawled beside it, in the same firm hand as the unmaking section, were two words: Frozen Lake. The frozen lake. He remembered seeing it from a high window, a vast, flat expanse of gray-white, almost swallowed by the surrounding woods. His mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and nascent hope. The ritual was vague, terrifying in its implications, but it offered a path. What did that mean? His own memories? A part of himself? He understood then the full horror. To defeat the house, he might have to give it something it craved, something vital, but in a way that would paradoxically weaken it. As he stood, the journal clutched in his hand, the air in the pantry seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. The faint scent of decay intensified, now laced with a metallic tang. He heard a low groan, not from the house's old timbers, but from deep within its stone foundation, a sound of ancient, disturbed slumber. The house knew. It was aware of his discovery, of his burgeoning intent. He had found his weapon, but he had also announced his rebellion. The fight had truly begun. Eleanor, the gardener. This realization, rather than paralyzing him, ignited a cold, focused resolve. He would uncover its mechanism, its true nature, before it could fully claim him. A faint creak echoed from the hallway, not the usual settling of old timber, but something deliberate like a footstep on a loose floorboard. Marcus paused, his head cocked, listening. The house had always been noisy, a symphony of groans and whispers, but this felt different, more pointed. He moved towards the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass lantern he now carried everywhere. As he stepped into the main hall, a gust of frigid air swept through, though every window was latched, every door closed. It carried the faint, cloying smell of stagnant water and damp earth. A distant thud reverberated through the floorboards. Then another, closer. The wallpaper, peeling in strips, seemed to writhe in the periphery of his vision, the faded patterns reforming into grotesque visages. He blinked, and they were merely peeling paper again. He reached a narrow service passage, one he had been exploring for clues regarding the property's drainage system. The heavy wooden door, which he had left ajar only an hour prior, was now firmly shut, its latch secured. It refused to budge. He put his shoulder to the wood, pushing with all his weight. The door remained immobile, as if fused with the frame. A low, guttural groan emanated from behind it, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his chest cavity rather than his ears. It was the sound of something deeply displeased. This was no longer passive haunting. This was active obstruction. The house was fighting back. He turned, seeking an alternative route, only to find the corridor he had just traversed, now obscured by a thick, swirling mist that had materialized from nowhere. It tasted of decay and old blood. The gardener, perhaps? He would not be broken. He forced himself forward, stepping into the mist. He stumbled, his knees threatening to buckle, his own memories of loss and isolation rising unbidden to the forefront of his consciousness. He saw his parents' distant faces, heard the faint echoes of childhood neglect, felt the familiar pang of academic solitude. The house was weaponizing his own past against him. He pushed through it, a desperate guttural sound escaping his throat. He found himself in the grand drawing room, a space usually filled with a dusty, quiet dignity. Now, however, it was a maelstrom of phantom activity. Chandeliers swayed violently, though no breeze stirred the heavy velvet curtains. Portraits on the walls seemed to weep black tears, their painted eyes following his every move. A woman in a faded white gown, her face indistinct, drifted across the room, her hands reaching, her voice a silent shriek that resonated in his skull. He saw the surface, smooth, unbroken. The air, sharp and bitter, bit at exposed skin. Below the clear ice, shapes twisted, indistinct, but unmistakably human. The frozen lake, a place of disappearance. The house was showing him its trophy cabinet. The visions were no longer mere specters. They were extensions of the house's will, designed to erode his sanity, to break his will, to make him surrender. He was not just observing history, he was becoming entangled in it, the lines blurring with terrifying speed. The house wanted him to join its silent, frozen collection. It wanted his memories, his life, his very essence. And it was willing to tear him apart, piece by agonizing piece, to get it. He was exhausted, psychologically battered, but a stubborn ember of defiance still glowed within him. Not yet. The shadowy figure lunged, not with physical form, but with a cold vacuum that ripped at his very sense of self. It was not a blow, but an extraction, a momentary terrifying void where his thoughts should have been. Marcus staggered, his breath catching in his throat, a raw, involuntary gasp. He felt a fleeting, dizzying sensation, as if a thread had been tugged from the intricate tapestry of his identity, leaving a frayed edge. He clenched his jaw, forcing his feet to remain anchored, refusing to yield the space within his mind. This was the house's ultimate weapon. Not a physical assault, but a predatory hunger for the very essence of its inhabitants. He pushed forward, the mist coiling around his legs like hungry tendrils. Each step was a defiance. The stone walls around him seemed to ripple, the ancient carvings on their surface twisting into grotesque, fleeting visages. Lost, forgotten, consumed. Marcus ignored them, focusing on the insistent thrumming beneath his feet, a low, resonant vibration that pulled him deeper into the manor's foundations. He knew this sound now. It was the house's heartbeat, the rhythm of its malevolent life. His plan, desperate and born of a scholar's meticulous research into the obscure and the horrific, depended on reaching its true core. He had spent weeks deciphering the fragmented journals of previous occupants, noting patterns, cross-referencing their descent into madness with the house's own subtle, insidious methods. There was a weakness, he believed, a point of vulnerability in its parasitic existence. He could feel it seeping into his joints, stiffening his muscles. The staircase opened into a vast circular chamber, far larger than he had anticipated. A faint greenish luminescence pulsed from within it, illuminating the space with an unsettling biological glow. In the center of the chamber, a depression formed a shallow pool, filled with an inky, motionless liquid that reflected no light, absorbing it completely. As Marcus approached the pool, The air grew impossibly frigid. His breath plumed in thick white clouds. The faint light from the walls intensified, then flickered, distorting the space. The leathery walls of the chamber seemed to recede, stretching outwards into an impossible distance. The inky pool in the center began to expand, its surface rippling, then hardening. A sound, like a colossal sigh, echoed through the vast, now featureless expanse. Suddenly, Marcus was no longer in the chamber. He stood on a surface of slick, obsidian-black ice. The light from his lantern was swallowed by an infinite, desolate horizon. He was on a frozen lake. The ice beneath his boots groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through his very bones. It was impossibly vast, stretching in every direction under a sky that was a perpetual bruised twilight. But it was not empty. Beneath the polished surface, trapped within the black ice, he could discern forms. Faces, hundreds of them. Muted screams seemed to emanate from their gaping mouths, silent and terrifying. They were not merely reflections of past residents, but fragments of their very essence, their consciousness suspended, perfectly preserved, and perfectly consumed. This was not just a memory projection. This was the house's larder, its archive of devoured identities. It was a fragment of Marcus, caught mid-scream, eyes pleading. The frozen lake was the culmination of its power, the tangible manifestation of its centuries of consumption. It was the processing core, the place where identities were broken down and absorbed, adding to the house's own malevolent sentience. His plan, which had seemed so theoretically sound in the flickering lamplight of his study, now felt impossibly small against this overwhelming frozen tableau of suffering. He had theorized the house fed on patterns, on the repetition of fear and despair. He believed that by introducing a discordant, indigestible element, by severing a key connection, he could starve it, perhaps even destroy it. He had brought the artifact, a small, heavy iron-bound ledger from the manor's earliest days, filled with the unsettling coded writings of its original builder, a man whose sanity had demonstrably fractured. Marcus believed this ledger, imbued with the builder's original primal fear and confusion, contained the key to disrupting the house's parasitic cycle. It was an anomaly, an internal poison. With a grunt of pure, unadulterated resolve, Marcus pulled the heavy ledger from the satchel. He clutched it like a shield, a weapon. He had to force the house to choke on its own history. The frozen lake was the threshold, and he was about to step across it. The thrumming intensified, a low, resonant vibration that pulled Marcus deeper into the manor's foundations. It was the house's heartbeat, the rhythm of its malevolent life, and he followed it. A scholar's meticulous plan forming in his mind. Each step echoed, not just from his boots on the rough-hewn floor, but from the very walls, as if the house itself were listening, breathing. He descended a narrow, spiraling staircase, the crude steps slick with condensation, his fingers brushing against clammy moss. The light from his lantern struggled against the encroaching darkness, illuminating only patches of the rough-hewn rock face. He understood the house now. It was not merely a structure, but a vast, hungry consciousness, an entity that consumed identity, weaving the memories of its inhabitants into its own fabric. His plan, desperate and born of his academic rigor, was not to destroy it, but to overload it, to offer it something it could not digest, something antithetical to its nature. The staircase ended in a cavernous space, a natural grotto expanded by generations of subterranean construction. Here, the thrumming became a palpable force, vibrating through his bones, resonating in his teeth. The air was heavy, charged, and a faint phosphorescent glow emanated from the far wall, pulsating in rhythm with the house's insidious beat. This was the core, the repository, the vast, silent maw. As he approached, the glow intensified, revealing an intricate network of crystalline structures embedded within the rock. They pulsed with a soft internal light, shifting through shades of amber, violet, and deep crimson. Marcus felt a pull, a subtle mental current attempting to draw his thoughts, to sift through his consciousness like a skilled archivist. He resisted, focusing his mind, drawing up the specific memory he had cultivated, polished, and prepared. This was the reveal. The crystalline matrix was not inert. These were not mere echoes. They were consciousnesses, absorbed and integrated, their individual identities dissolved into the house's vast collective mind. He saw a woman's startled eyes, a man's hand reaching out, a child's fleeting smile, all suspended, timeless, within the glowing lattice. The house was not just a devourer of life force. It was a living archive, a monstrous, ever-expanding database of stolen existence. He closed his eyes, concentrating, pushing back against the subtle tendrils that sought to unravel his composure. He summoned the memory, not of fear or love, but of profound, indifferent emptiness. He stood on the frozen lake. The memory was vivid, tactile. The vast, flat expanse of ice, stretching to an indistinguishable horizon under a featureless gray sky. The biting wind, not a caress, but a scour, stripping sensation from his exposed skin. The overwhelming sense of insignificance, of being a minuscule, temporary speck against the backdrop of an indifferent, uncaring world. He projected it, focusing his entire being, pushing this raw, desolate expanse of memory into the pulsing core. The house recoiled. The thrumming faltered, a discordant shudder running through the foundations. The phosphorescent crystals flickered wildly, their colors shifting to an angry, agitated red. Marcus felt a backlash, a torrent of chaotic memories crashing against his mental barriers. He kept pushing the memory, an offering of absolute nothingness, a poison to a being that thrived on meaning and identity. The house screamed, a soundless internal shriek that vibrated through the very bedrock, shaking the cavern. Dust rained down. The air grew thick with an almost tangible despair, the collective anguish of its absorbed inhabitants lashing out. He was no longer just Marcus, the historian. He was the ice, the wind, the vast, indifferent emptiness. A sharp, cracking sound, like ice splitting under immense pressure, echoed through the chamber. One of the largest crystalline structures directly in front of him fractured. The thrumming stopped. An unnatural silence descended, profound and absolute, broken only by the faint, ragged sound of Marcus's own breathing. He stood, swaying, the cavern around him seeming to hold its breath. The remaining crystals still pulsed, but with a weaker, more erratic rhythm. He had inflicted a wound, a deep, perhaps even devastating injury. But the cost... Marcus looked at his hands. They felt alien, numb. He tried to recall his own name, his past, the details of his life before this manor. The memories were there, but they felt distant, like artifacts in a museum, observed but not truly lived. The profound, indifferent emptiness of the frozen lake had not just been pushed into the house. It had seeped into him, becoming a fundamental part of his being. He was no longer entirely Marcus. Not entirely. But he had not been fully absorbed either. He was something else now, an altered state, a living wound within the house's vast diminished consciousness, a shard of ice embedded in its core. And he was there too, a part of that space, forever altered, forever lingering.